Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Hey, Dad, thanks for joining us on the Father on Purpose podcast. Do you have children, or have you yourself ever wrestled with things like anxiety or OCD or mental health challenges that have been very difficult to walk through? Maybe you're walking through one right now. Today, we have a special guest, Jon Seidl, who's going to walk with us through his story and how he has done that. Before we get to Jon, I want to remind you that every single Monday, we publish a newsletter that encourages dads like you. It's totally free. You come to our website, you sign up. It's called Mountain Monday. Why do we call it Mountain Monday? Because some weeks it feels like you got to climb a mountain as a dad, and we want to help guide you up that hill. And we have Bible lessons in there. We have our latest blogs, our latest podcasts. We have some encouragement, some action items, and even occasionally some special offers. So join the tribe of Mountain Monday recipients. Now, right at almost 20,000 dads are getting Mountain Monday every single Monday. Go become one of them. It's totally free. We would love to tell you a little more. Lawson, I'll hand this part over to you if you'd like. Tell us a little bit about our guest coming in today, and then we'll let Jon introduce himself and his family.
He is a super cool cat. You're going to love this. Professionally, Jon, he spent over like a decade in digital media, so really smart, president, founder of the Veritas Creative. And you don't get the joy of getting to see him in person because we don't publish this video, but he's got this cool sign behind his desk that says the Veritas Creative. I've always wanted something like that. But anyway.
That says Veritas Creative?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, right on.
Show brought to you.
Well, now I do.
Veritas
now that
Creative.
I know Jon, I want that sign. Yeah. He's worked with actor Kirk Cameron and media personality Glenn Beck. He was the managing editor at The Blaze. So check that out. And then most recently, author of the book called Finding Rest, Navigating the Valleys of Anxiety, Faith, and Life. And I love it. He's also, I want to hear about this, Jon, a Green Bay Packers fanatic. I got to go and sit in the bleachers once, and it was super, super cold. I've never seen anything like it. I can't believe those people sit out there for that long. So, Jon, welcome to the show, and I want to turn it over to you, man. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family so that all the dads listening can learn a little bit more about who you are.
Well, Lawson and Kent, thank you so much for having me. This is great. Been looking forward to this for a while. And I can say, even as a Wisconsin native, I live in Dallas now, but even as a Wisconsin native, I went to the last Packer game of the season this year, and I still froze my you-know-what off sitting in those bleachers. So how do they do it? I don't know, because even when you're a seasoned vet or an owner of the team, like I am, you still freeze.
All right. Well, that's good to hear, because I was just like, I mean, they're out there for hours. It was like, it was -10. I don't know.
And some guys do like the no shirt thing, and I'm just like,
right.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Wow.
So, but yeah, I'm originally from Wisconsin. I live in the Dallas area now. I have 2 kids, a 7-year-old, soon to be 8-year-old girl, and a 5-year-old boy. They could not be any more different. Oh my word. And my daughter's just like really like emotional and like very intellectual, and my son is just like wild and crazy and reactive. And so my wife and I are learning how to love the children that are so different. So my wife and I have been married 14 years. It'll be 15 years this summer. And we met in New York City, where we went to college. So small town boy from Wisconsin goes to the big city, meets the love of his life, and the rest is history.
Wow. Did you meet her on a subway?
No, I met her in the Empire State Building.
Hey.
Oh my goodness.
There you go.
It's like when Harry met Sally.
Well,
Like on a tour, or you were working?
So my college at the time was actually in the Empire State Building.
Oh.
So I went to the King's College in New York City. It's now down in Wall Street, but every day I was going to the Empire State Building and had classes there. And so my wife, I saw her with these yellow high heels, and that was it.
Good for you.
That's excellent. Tell us a little bit, Jon, about how you came to write your first book. What was a little bit of that personal journey? I know that's a really long story, and you could probably take the whole episode just talking about that, because it's a life project of sorts for you. But tell us a little bit about how you came to write that book and the challenges that you walked through, 8, 9, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a fun journey. I would say, for most of my life, I knew there was something different about me, in the sense that, I just couldn't get thoughts out of my head, right? I'd start thinking about something and it would just kind of get stuck there in this like endless loop, And so I talk about how it was like a dog chasing its tail, right? But the dog actually probably had a better chance of actually getting its tail than I did to figure out whatever was going through my head. And so I think I just kind of chalk that up as I'm a little bit more high strung, tightly wound, that kind of stuff. And going from Wisconsin to New York City, I think that was exacerbated, right? When you're in the city that never sleeps, right? When you're in the city that never sleeps with a mind that never sleeps, not the greatest combination. But by the grace of God, I got through high school, I got through college, and, marriage has a way of refining us, right? And showing us our blind spots.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. And so my wife, probably about 5 years into our marriage, there was an incident where, man, the wrong sweetener was in my coffee, and everyone's going to be like, what? I don't like Splenda. I like Sweet and Low. And we were going on a walk. We'd gone to this coffee shop, and I was going to the bathroom, and I said, hey, can you make sure that there's no Splenda in my coffee? Yeah. I got you. Okay. Come back from the bathroom. She hands me my coffee, and it's like one of those like Charlie Chaplin, like spit takes, And I'm like, there's Splenda in here. And I just got mad. I got mad. I couldn't tell you exactly why I got mad, right? Which then leads to you getting even more mad. I think there's probably dads out there who maybe your wife or your kids say something and you're like, I don't know why that annoys me so much, but man, go to your room or something. You know what I mean? It's just like, this is and I'm not saying you have anxiety or OCD if that's the case, but in my case, it ruined the weekend, right? And so my wife, towards the end of the weekend, just kind of crying and broke down in front of me, and she's like, listen, I'm not going anywhere, but we can't live like this. And you need to get help. And so when you see that person, when you see your wife broken down in front of you, desperate for help, even if you don't think you need it, right? Guys, men, dads, fathers,
right?
That's a clue. Right.
Oh yeah.
And so I said, okay. So I booked an appointment to the first psychiatrist I could get into, which is like 2 weeks, which if you want to figure out if you have anxiety or OCD, just have to wait 2 weeks to actually figure out if you have anxiety or OCD. Kind of get your answer.
That'll confirm it. Right.
Yeah. And so I walk in, this psychiatrist, he looks like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, which in a way gave me like some comfort. I don't know. I liked the fact that my psychiatrist looked like Doc Brown, and not too far into it, he kind of looks at me and says, Mr. Seidl, you have what's called GAD, generalized anxiety disorder with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'll tell you what, when I heard those words, I was so excited. And people are like, what? I'm like, yeah, because I finally knew what I was up against, right? Yeah. Like I think sometimes in our marriages, in our families, we just want to stick our heads in the sand, right? And then we get frustrated when we don't know, like, why do we keep fighting with our wife, or why do we keep, blowing up at our kids, right? And it's like, well, because we haven't fully identified and addressed what the issue is. So for me, it was like, before that, the lights were off. I was punching in the dark. I knew something was there, right? But then I got the diagnosis. It's like the lights came on. I could see what was in front of me. I could land my punches. I could, plan my jujitsu moves, right?
Right.
And land those punches. And so it became, and this is what I talk about in the book, in the workbook, Call It By Its Name is one of the main chapters. In the first chapter is Call It By Its Name, right? When we can name something, It's actually very biblical. Like we gain power over it, right? And so if you look in Genesis, what was the job that Adam was given, right?
Yeah,
Adam was given the
everything.
job of naming the animals.
Interesting.
Right. And in that, it shows and asserts dominion, right? It shows the hierarchy in creation. I was just reading a book even recently, and this concept has been around since the beginning of time. And then you see it like in Native American culture, right? Like the naming of the child in that culture is insanely important, right?
Yeah.
And it again, it shows they are now welcomed into the tribe, right? It shows that they now have a place, right?
Yeah, it gives them an identity and a definition.
Exactly. So when we can name those things that are going on inside of us, for me, anxiety and OCD. For you listening to this, maybe it's anger, maybe it's pride, maybe it's whatever. Biblically, that helps us assert power and dominion over it.
Man, you know, one time, John, I heard Tony Dungy was interviewed, and he said something about, he said, hey, if you only think about yourself, that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you selfish. And he went on to talk about the fact that once you can put a more accurate label on the problem, you can then begin to work on it. Just to say, hey, I'm just a bad guy. Where do you start with that, right?
You mean like that's so general, you mean?
Yeah, but well, it's so general, and you can't identify the opposite. Well, what's the opposite of bad guy, good guy? Well, what do I got to do? Well, I don't know. What's the opposite of being selfish? Caring for others, or being others focused, or being altruistic. So you can find the opposite once you've labeled the thing. And whether it's a big deal like OCD or anxiety, or it's a big problem, you need some maybe time or counseling or other things to kind of walk through, or it's something simpler, naming it is often the very first step to conquering it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, and there's numerous examples of this in the Bible too, right? You look at Jacob wrestling with the angel on the I think it's the Jacob River, right? And what was he saying? He kept saying, "Tell me your name. Tell me your name." And by the way, and then what did the angel do? Gave him a new name, which is kind of interesting, right? So this concept of identifying, refusing to stick our head in the sand, looking at, those warning signs that God has put in our life, so for me, it was my relationship with my wife was really rocky, right? Because she felt, these are her words, John, I'm always walking on eggshells. I don't know what's going to set you off. And again, it's not like set me off was not like, I'm a violent person, I'm punching the wall, but would put me on an endless thought cycle, make me on edge, make me ornery, make me not just fun to be around, right? And so listening to those warning signs, I think, and recognizing them is really important.
John, I'm surprised. I guess had I not heard that story, I would have thought that as a child, did you stand out? I mean, I guess my question is, it seems like 5 years into a marriage was when you had it defined and kind of, gave it a name, and that helped from there forward for progression. Not anything before then. That I'm sure that was a struggle, and then for it to finally come to a head because of a Splenda packet, when you're 5 years into a marriage. Talk about it. I don't want to say this wrong, but it took a long time. Was it because you didn't ask for help, or your parents didn't identify it? And if you can help wrap around the dad out there who is like wondering, am I seeing some outward sign of something that I need to help address in my child? And maybe just hasn't took a step, like they're dismissing it as, I don't know, it's a little weird habit, picking at your fingers or pulling your hair or whatever. And was that the case with you? And then how can dads be more astute in helping to figure something out, and then therefore, getting it defined and identified?
Yeah, great question. So I would say once you're diagnosed, right? Once those lights come on, and then you see that attacker in the room, you can then look back and say, oh, I've seen where this attacker has shown up before. He was on the street corner. He was casing my house. You know what I mean? Like, you, in hindsight, you start to look back. And so I even talk about this in the book. In hindsight, I look back and then identified my first OCD episode at about 12 years old. Right. Now, at the time, it may have seemed like I was just an emotional kid. Right. And so that's what I talk about, like being more tightly wound. So when I looked back, I could see the evidence. Now, you asked a really great question about my parents. And so I love my parents. And I talk about in the book, and then there are some hard conversations and some things that they didn't do well or right. And so I would say they subscribed at the time to kind of a faith tradition that treated God more like a vending machine, like a genie. And so instead, and then especially when it came to mental health, right? They just didn't want to talk about those type of things, right? And so I think the church historically has failed in that aspect. We've gotten a little better, but so they weren't going out of the way to try to identify mental health issues, right? Because it was always just the case of praying more, having more faith, repenting more, right? And so I remember conversations, in fact, right? And I write about this conversation in the book of overhearing my parents talk about people with mental health issues, and they're like, oh man, just got to pray more. They should not get on medication because, my mom was in the healthcare industry actually. And she said, oh man, if they get on medication, like they're going to have that scarlet letter, insurance companies are going to want to cover them, blah, blah, blah. So I think there was in some ways an active campaign to ignore it. But also back then, right? I was a child of the 80s and 90s. Yeah. People weren't talking about this stuff like they are now. Yeah.
We've learned a lot more about the brain in the last.
And I think dads have come a long way.
Yes.
Just as a part of being, in general society, it's not so taboo anymore.
Yes.
But still, I don't know that I would be able, and I'm thankful I don't have little kids anymore in today's world. I think being a kid today is harder than it was when I was a kid, and being a parent. But I would probably. I wouldn't go down the road of your parents, but I would probably think, I don't know, it's just some little tick or something, and not dig deeper to what you said about defining it, identifying it, giving it a name. I think really resonates. And so how do you suggest dads keep an eye out?
Yeah. And so this is not, I swear this isn't a shameless plug, but it's part of the reason I wrote the book. Right. Huh. So I tell people from the very beginning, I'm not a clinician. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a counselor. Right. What I am is someone who has experienced this. Right. So part of you as a dad, learning and growing and being able to recognize what's going on is listening to conversations like this. It's like reading the book where I go through and talk about what my anxiety and OCD has looked like, right? And not everyone has the same quote unquote symptoms, right? I think a lot of people think about OCD. They think about like a Howie Mandel who's, always washing his hands, right? Listen, my wife would probably like me to wash my hands more, right? So that's not the way it manifests. So it's learning and understanding how it can manifest in different ways. And in fact, then I wrote a whole chapter for loved ones of people who love people like me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's literally called, Lawson, Help Me Understand. That's the title of the chapter.
Yeah.
So
Perfect.
It's walking through, dads, moms, brothers, sisters, friends. How can you kind of identify this? What does it look like to help us? Right. What to say, what not to say. And I'll just give you a little anecdote. Like, I think the fact that, that I have this does make me a little bit more, my radar, raises my radar a little bit. And I've recognized it in my daughter. And here's one of the ways I've recognized it in my daughter. This was a couple months ago. She got like not even really in trouble, right? It was very, compared to my son, like I said earlier, like when my daughter gets in trouble, it's, it's like an angel tooted or something, it's like in comparison. Um, and so, but she went to bed and I could just hear her crying. And so I went back up there and she goes, Daddy, I just can't stop thinking about what I did and I cannot get it out of my head. Right. Well, as someone with my OCD is called intrusive thought OCD, I identify that as, oh, okay, she's having a little bit of a thought cycle. Now, does that mean like we took her to a counselor right away and put her on medication? No, right? Because there are, by the way, sometimes you're because this is a brain issue, right? There are ways that your brain can work and grow and whatnot. So it's not like we're saying 911, get this girl to a counselor right away, but we are monitoring it, right? For sure. And we're looking for some of those thought cycles, right? My son, he has a tendency to pick at, he's 5, right? He has a tendency to pick at his fingers and his toes, right? We're watching that, right?
Mm-hmm.
To see if that starts to devolve into something more. So those are just 2 practical ways.
How have you found the line, Jon, or have you found the line between, because I would guess that's a bit of a razor's edge in that if someone called me and said, hey, when you meet Jon Seidl, you need to know he has OCD. And then knowing that, I start to read into that. I'm like, oh, I can see how he put his lamp there. Look how the book is on the back shelf and look at that thing up there. And I start to map onto you things because of what I've been told or I have a bias and I see in you all this stuff that may or may not be red warning bells and, big flags. How have you navigated that? Because I'm certain that I was walking with one of my boys the other day and he was feeling sad about something that he had done that was wrong, and it was kind of dogging him. And quite frankly, Bible would call that conviction. Like he probably needed to think that was wrong. And he was right to think it was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so there's a part of that that's natural and healthy and part of growing up and maturing and noticing your own sin. There's that's true. Then it's also true. I've walked with young men who have had diagnosed OCD. And it's also true that they have a unique bent in that regard. And it's just their brain plays some tricks on them that are different. How have you navigated that line between, reading in and seeing it if it isn't maybe there, and then being perceptive when it is there? I sat down recently with Chris Harper. He's the executive director of Better Man Ministries. And I asked him a question about the state of manhood today. And his answer was both depressing and a bit hilarious. Check this out.
Yeah, it's a dumpster fire. That's what I would say the state of manhood is today. It's not just shaky, it's an absolute dumpster fire. The only categories that men are excelling in are terrible categories like incarceration, suicide rates, depression rates, not attending church, things of that nature. Women are far and ahead excelling beyond men, whether it's graduation rates, college admittance rates, professional degrees, church attendance, spiritual growth. Women are dominating, and it shouldn't be like that. So what's happened to men, in the 90s, we talked a lot about passivity, like men would just be passive. And I still think that's true. Like we wrestle with passivity, but the reality is men are slow quitting their masculinity today. They're just kind of devolving into the background and becoming non-existent. And it's a serious problem that is affecting every facet of our society.
Better Man is one of our ministry partners. We love what Chris and his team there are doing. If you or your church is looking for a group study for your men to go through that covers the essentials of biblical manhood and helps men have a clear vision of how they can be as a man, they can gain confidence, become the man they want to be, improve relationships, and create a more purposeful life, check out the resources from our friends Better Man. You can find those at betterman.com. That's betterman.com.
Great question, and it does really go well off of what Lawson asked. So perfect question. I think the heart of the question is this: how do you know when it's something to be worried about in clinical versus something that's quote unquote just normal, right? And so let me start by answering this way. A, we all have anxiety, right? anxiety is your fight or flight response, right? Where something happens, it's your reaction to an outside stimuli. You know, I joke about in Texas here. It's like, you know, we have the longest yellow lights in the world. And so you like, you know, you're coming up to a yellow and you're like, is this going to be yellow, you know, for 5 minutes? Or like every once in a while, there's a 30-second one. You're like, I'm gunning it. Right. And then it turns red and you're like, you get that feeling right in your chest, in your gut, right? That's your fight or flight response. What happens with people with anxiety and OCD, and by the way, everyone who has OCD has anxiety. Not everyone who has anxiety has OCD. OCD is, in a sense, a way to, it's an extreme way to deal with your anxiety, right? And so what I tell people is, when that fight or flight response, when that anxiety, when that those thought cycles, when those feelings start to hamper or interrupt your daily life, that is when, okay, we need to do something here. So, for example, my daughter, right? I could tell she was in a thought cycle. Now, if she would have woke up the next morning and said, I can't go to school, this is continuing to eat me up, and starts withdrawing from playing with her friends or that kind of thing. If my son starts picking at his toenails, right, and does it endlessly for hours, right? Okay, that's hampering his daily life, right? He's not playing, he's not, you know, even watching TV, right? He becomes so fixated on that. So it's when that fixation starts to really trip you up and eat into, you know, maybe things you used to love doing, right? That's where that's the litmus test that is really important and helpful, and hopefully dads can hear that.
Yeah.
So is part of an antidote, well, the title of your book, Finding Rest. It is hard to find rest nowadays. It feels like I was in writing myself some notes before today. I was wondering to myself, like, how do I rest, and how does our family talk about it? And in that process, I remembered growing up as a kid, I would go and visit my grandparents for like the entire summer. Both my parents worked, so I would go out there and we worked. It was a big farm. I loved it. But part of what I remember vividly is sitting on the back porch at the end of a long day. We've had an early dinner. You sleep really well when you're that tired, you know, so every morning was early. But it was just quiet, you know, and there were no distractions. There was a TV was in there, but we turned it on like once a week, maybe.
For the Lawrence Welk show, probably.
Right, exactly. And so I love that. I'm thankful that I got to experience that. And I'm going on a canoe camping trip in Canada in late June, and I can't wait. We'll literally have no cell phone, no nothing, and it's just, you know, 3 or 4 of us. That I think it's going to be very restful. And so on the tone of, let's define, like you said, let's define rest. How do we do that today?
Great question. And so what I tell people is, so what you're describing is one aspect of rest. It's really called, you know, it's solitude, right? And so I talk about some of the spiritual disciplines that help us find rest, and solitude is one of them, which, by the way, is not, you know, there's a difference between solitude and retreat, right? So what you're suggesting and what you're talking about is not retreat, right? I think sometimes as dads, we want to retreat. We just want to get away. And so we retreat into unhealthy things, right? Unhealthy habits. Solitude is not an emptying, it's a filling up, right? And so I think that's the difference. Retreat is an emptying, right? And even some of the Eastern religions, right, kind of preach that emptying out. No, solitude is, I want to fill back up with the Holy Spirit. I want to fill back up with what Jesus has to offer me. And but in general, how I define rest is not rest as a final destination, but rest as respite. It's the rest stops on a journey, right? So if you're traveling, you know, if you're driving from Florida to Wisconsin, right, you're going to stop at those rest stops to
Can we go back to why would you do that?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just curious. You picked that specific example.
Because I think in my head, we as a family did a road trip once from Wisconsin to Florida. I guess that was just kind of stuck in my
Well,
head.
that direction I understand. It's why would you
Yeah.
go back? I don't understand.
Yeah, right. But it's rest is rest stop. It's finding those rest stops along the way that allow you to refuel, to recharge, to, if you think about it, we were given the armor of God, right? And I think that inherently suggests that we're not just in one battle, right? We're going to be in multiple battles. And so there are times where you get done with a battle and you have to go back behind your lines and you have to shine that armor and you have to, eat food, you have to sleep, right? And so what I tell people is finding those moments of refueling, which, Lawson, in some days, that's going to look like sitting on the back porch with a glass of, lemonade or an Arnold Palmer or whatever, and just soaking in the sunset, right? But you know what? Some days it might be that trip up to the Boundary Waters or, in a canoe, which is not quote unquote restful, right? I mean, you're probably going to exert a lot more energy than you did sitting on Grandma and Grandpa's back porch, but that is rest as well.
We go to Open Bible is something that we, you go in there and put a word and it'll tell you scriptures. Here's when you put in rest on Open Bible. Mark 6:31 says, and he said to them, Jesus, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going. They had no leisure even to eat. And then Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And
I think what the second part of that one, Lawson, you can correct me if not, I think that is the same verse where he talks about, for my yoke is easy, but my burden is light.
That's right.
Yeah. And what I love about that is too many people forget about that second part. And if you look at the yoke, what a yoke was, it was work. It was how you, put two oxen together. And so what's interesting is that again, my yoke is easy, my burden is light means rest when you come to Jesus doesn't mean you're not going to have to work on your stuff, right? It doesn't mean that you're not going to be called to do something, right? It doesn't mean, well, I'm just going to lay on the couch. Hey, babe, I know you want help with the dishes, but Jesus told me to rest in him. And man, this I'm just resting so great watching football right now. It's like, no. There is work that entails and involves. So sorry to cut you off there.
That's perfect. No, that's right.
Man, yeah.
What you're saying, it says, take my yoke upon you. So he's putting this on us, but he says, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So come do this work with me, and it will provide rest for your soul.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I talk about in the introduction to the new workbook, right? Is this is about doing the work, right? And so the title of the new workbook is called An Invitation to Go Deeper, right? And I'm very clear is that invitation involves you maybe having to address some things, right? Maybe having to sift through some stuff. But listen, there's also some comedy and fun stuff in there too. It's some fun exercises, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want people to think it's just like, oh my gosh, you're just going to beat me up, during this workbook. No, but you just got to be willing to do the work.
I think what's interesting, Jon, is we deal with so many dads at Manhood Journey, and we have surveys coming in and emails coming in and face-to-face events. And so we just have tons of input from the father community, in particular, fathers who are probably Christian fathers who have some kind of faith background. And one thing that I find super interesting is when you look at what Lawson talked about a minute ago regarding the mission that Jesus and the disciples were on. No offense to anybody doing any work out there, is more important than the mission we're all on. And what I mean by that is he had few years to have the Messiah's reign on earth begin and have him set in motion the one church that would save the world. And so that was a really important mission. And even so, built into the Jewish calendar, built into their behavior patterns, was this notion of rest. It was sacred. It was very, very important. And I bump into dads all the time who are like, well, what I'm doing is too important to rest. I've got my sales quota to meet or whatever they're doing. And I'm not diminishing the work that we're doing today in 2023. What I'm saying is God can do more in 6 days than you can do in 7.5 with no sleep and living on meds to sleep, living on caffeine to wake up, and this is pot calling the kettle black. Cause here's my second cup of coffee for the day. Have you bumped into folks who you just feel like are rest deficient, where what they really need is not just to take a week off or a month off. They need a rhythm. They need a pattern of resting. It's not just this one sabbatical for, 2 weeks or a month. And then all of a sudden, you can go 10 more years, red lined, white hot, white knuckled. I feel like some of us are living at that pace, and it's not because what we're doing is so important. It's because we're just a little bit afraid to slow down.
And our kids feel that pressure too.
Oh my goodness, big time. And I'm just curious, like in your travels, and you lived in New York and you were on the media circuit where, the cycles where, the media circuit used to be on the weekly cycle back when we had weekly papers. Then it was, in the 1940s. And then by the 80s, it's on daily cycles. And now it's on split second cycles where you got to break the news 2.5 minutes before the other guy does. That pace, I'm sure you saw people who just suffered from lack of rest, and you see it even now.
Yeah. I'm putting my hand up right now. It's
confession time.
Yeah. That was one of the reasons I had to get out of the news business. Right. Because especially where I was doing it while I was undiagnosed. And so if I run 100 miles an hour now, right, I was running 1,000 miles an hour then. Right. And so, really just burned out. Right. And so I would say, yes, I think there are so many people that are afraid to feel like they are not doing enough, right? And I get that too, right? I mean, there'll be times just, whether in my business or in my writing or whatnot, where it's like I'll come to some afternoons and I'll be like, I guess I could do X, Y, and Z, or I could go on a walk, right? And it's like I feel guilty. Oh no, you got to
exactly.
be whatever. You like feeling you got to feel anxious about something, right?
Yeah.
And I'm reminded by this. I'm reminded of this quote from Martin Luther, and I think it's applicable here. And it says, something like, "I have so much to do today that I shall spend the first 3 hours in prayer."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, of like, we can feel like we have this incredible work, and whether that's true or not. But let's say it is. Well, guess what? You actually need to spend more time resting and getting in tune with what the Lord has for you than if you were, weren't busy, or if your work wasn't important, right? And so I think sometimes we put this pressure on ourselves as husbands, as fathers. We feel like, hey, we have to be the breadwinner or the leader, and so that looks like I'm going to be running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I will say, like, one of the things I went through another season of depression this past winter, and went back into Christian therapy. And my therapist asked me a really important question that I thought was great. She goes, "What does a healthy and non-depressed Jon look like? Like, what is that?" And I thought about it, and I said, "It means saying yes more to my family. It means spending time with them more. It means slowing down to be with them." Right. And that's what I love about therapy, right? Is like, they just ask you the questions and it's like, oh, I did know that answer,
it was in there.
but it's important to do that. And so for me, it was like, 2 nights ago, my wife, we got done with dinner, and usually we start winding down. She goes, "Hey, do you just want to go on a scooter ride with the kids?" In my head, my initial response is, well, no, I can make an excuse, or do I really want to do that? And I was like, I slowed down. I was like, yes. And she kind of looked at me. She goes, "Oh, really?" I was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Right.
I remember the first kind of, like, I don't know, popular Christian guy who I heard talk about this topic was Michael Hyatt in Nashville. And he talked about taking naps. And he talked about how a very common part of his regimen the last long time, decade or so, has been when he can snag one, he might snag a 15 or 20 minute nap. And he was president of a publishing company. Like, there were, he had a big job, a lot of responsibilities. And it was just about this idea that kind of, whether you have to some degree, right, in the fallen world, we all have some mental health issue. And I'm not debating or degrading true, honest to goodness mental health issues. What I'm saying is, we're all fallen. We all have a brain that doesn't work exactly like it will work in eternity. And that brain is finite. and there's only certain things it can do. And I remember hearing somebody say, you've got to guard your capacity to make decisions. And I just like that phrasing. It's like, I've got to guard my capacity. Most plane crashes, most operations that go wrong, they get traced back to the pilot didn't get enough sleep, or the surgeon was on day 4 straight out. And it's this notion, and we're even seeing it now, where all like these elite athletes are talking about their 8 and 10 hour sleep nights, where they're like, yeah, the only way I can play at this level is to have a lot of sleep. And there's something about the rest brought to your brain that enables you to actually do better with the remaining time that you have than if you just went wide open all the time. Have you kind of bumped into some of that, Jon?
Yeah. And I think actually Michael Hyatt wrote a entire book called Free to Focus, which is really good. And
solid book. Yeah.
In there, he talks about, the idea of saying no. Right. And I think it might've been him. I was reading another book that was talking about this too. And, called Stolen Focus. And there was a guy who he would always say no to stuff, right? And so finally one day someone was like, why are you constantly saying no? If you're always saying no, you're way too busy. And the guy looks at him and goes, no, that's why I'm saying no, right? I don't have to get to the point of being so busy. Like, I'm saying no to protect myself from being too busy and overwhelmed, right? And what would that look like? What would that do to our marriages and our families and our mental health if we freed ourselves up more to say no? Because, in this hustle culture, the gig culture, right? We're always trying to say yes, and we feel guilty for saying no. And yet, if you look in the Bible, and you talked about this a little earlier, is Jesus went away a lot, right? He went away to pray. He went away to have solitude. He went away a lot, right? And then talked about, I have to be about my Father's business, right? So to your point, like the most important business in the world, and this guy is resting all the time, that should tell us something. And John Mark Comer wrote another good book on this too. I can't remember now the title, but about resting and it's very practical, right? It's not on the mental health side, but it's very practical.
Yeah. Jon, this will be it for me, and maybe we can bring the episode down on this. So rarely do you get to talk to the author before going into their stuff. The guys listening today, and hopefully, prayerfully, God's going to bring this message to a lot of dudes out there who need this. I think you're doing great work, and I appreciate it. I love it. I think God has worked through you, took you through some interesting trials, so that on the end of it, you got to help create something that's going to be of a valuable resource to a lot of people. There's a reason that it hit the Amazon bestseller lists in various forms, because people saw that and ran to it. But how do we give us your 101 on how to use it, what resources there are, and let our guys hear directly from you, the author, the creator of this. What's the best way to get through the book, the guidebook, the thought process for what's been created? And thank you, by the way.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I think what I tell people, I love that both the book and the workbook are out right now. Like when I was writing the book, I kind of had the workbook in the back of my head. And so they're really great to do in chorus together. And then in fact, I have a course out that if you want to even go for, you can do a small group with the book and the workbook, then you could even go deeper in the course that I have out on this. But what I tell people is have a conversation, right? So this is a conversation, I tell people, between you and me, right? But then in the course of this, have a conversation with yourself, have a conversation with the Lord about these things. And so I think hopefully my writing style is very easy to read, right? I don't, I studied philosophy in college. I don't, I'm not talking like Socrates in there. But yeah, I would just encourage people to do them in chorus, together. And I think there's two main points that I want people to hear. And the first one that the book really is kind of an undertone throughout the whole thing is what I call a proper theology of suffering. And what's beautiful about that is it's really helpful for us mental health sufferers. It's also really helpful for people who are just going through the crud of life, right? And so even if you don't struggle with mental health, I think there are aspects in here that'll be really helpful for you. So the first is a proper theology of suffering. Why do we struggle? Why, especially, it's the age-old question, why do good things happen, or excuse me, why do bad things happen to good people, right? And so I talk about that. And the second thing would be this: it's an ongoing battle, right? And I think we all have our ongoing battles. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some battles that we've been able to put to rest and some things we've been able to kill and dragons we've been able to slay, which are important. But hey, even Paul, right? He talks about the thorn in his flesh. It was just this annoying thing that kept coming up. And we all have our annoying thing that keeps coming up. That just means that we have to do battle against them, right? And that the Lord is allowing us to experience that to refine us and to redefine us, right? And so my encouragement, especially to dads and fathers and husbands out there, is don't be discouraged by your thorn, right? Be encouraged that the Lord has given you what you need, right? That his grace is sufficient. That's what Paul talks about in that verse when he's talking about the thorn, that his grace is sufficient. And the reason that he's allowing you to go through this, there is a reason, right? And it's maybe rooting out some stuff. I started watching these YouTube videos the other day. I don't know how I got recommended, but it's this guy in like Ireland or Scotland, and he treats. He's called a hoof trimmer, right? And so he trims the hooves of these cows and these horses. And like one of the aspects that is always present is, he might see a little infection, right? That's in the horn. And what has been shocking to me is he calls it, oh, all right, there's a cavity in there. And so you see this little thing, and then he just goes to town, and man, this cavity goes from 1 centimeter, and what's in there is actually, 6 inches worth of junk, right? and I just feel like that's a good analogy of we may think, oh, okay, I got this 1 centimeter hole. This is annoying. Well, guess what? You got to really dig in. You got to expose that, right? And so that exposing, that digging in might take months. It might take years, but you got to do it.
Love that.
Thank you, Jon. Guys, listen, what Jon shared today was super valuable, very timely, Jon, because so many of us are walking through these issues with ourselves and our own children. And I want to remind everyone, the name of the book, the first book, is Finding Rest, A Survivor's Guide to Navigating the Valleys of Anxiety, Faith, and Life by Jon Seidl. That's Seidl. You can find it on Amazon easily. And go snag the book. And if you want to go deeper, snag the companion guide that was released recently. And then go check out Jon's course. And you can do all of that. We'll put this stuff in the show notes, Jon. We'll put it in the description and on the notes so that guys can easily access it on whatever listening platform they're listening on. Jon, thank you so much for being a faithful husband, faithful dad, and a guy willing to share his thorn in the flesh and his challenges with the rest of us so that we can grow and lead our families well. We really appreciate you spending time today on the podcast.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. And everyone can just go to findrestnow.com, findrestnow.com, and that has everything that they need. So appreciate you guys. Love the work you're doing.
Thanks a lot, Jon. Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.